She woke to a cold blade against her throat and a stranger's voice telling her to get up, or he would kill her and her entire family. 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart was taken from her own bedroom, in her own home, in the middle of the night, while her 9-year-old sister lay just a few feet away, silently watching, terrified into stillness. For 9 months, Elizabeth was held captive less than 20 miles from that same bedroom, and for most of that time, no one, including hundreds of searchers and her own devastated family, had any idea where to look. She was found alive. Not every case on this channel ends that way, and this episode is, in that specific sense, unlike most of the others. This is her story. This is Unsolved and Unforgotten. Tonight's case became one of the most closely watched child recovery stories in American history, and, as of a Netflix documentary released just last month, one still generating new headlines more than 2 decades later. Everything in this episode is drawn from court records, trial testimony, and verified reporting through January of 2026. Elizabeth Ann Smart was born in 1987, the second of 6 children born to Ed and Lois Smart. By June of 2002, she was 14 years old, living with her family in Salt Lake City, Utah, just days away from her middle school graduation. Months earlier, in November of 2001, Elizabeth's mother, Lois, had encountered a panhandling man on a Salt Lake City street. She gave him $5 and later hired him for a brief roofing job at the family's home, an ordinary act of neighborly generosity that, at the time, raised no concern whatsoever. The man introduced himself using the name Emmanuel. His real name was Brian David Mitchell. In the early morning hours of June the 5th, 2002, Brian David Mitchell broke into the Smart family home while everyone slept. Armed with a knife, he entered the bedroom Elizabeth shared with her 9-year-old sister, Mary Catherine. He held the blade to Elizabeth's throat and ordered her to get up and leave quietly, threatening to kill her and every member of her family if she made a sound or resisted. Mary Catherine, feigning sleep just feet away, witnessed much of the abduction and later told investigators she recognized something in the voice she heard, though it would take months for that recognition to fully crystallize into a usable lead. Elizabeth was forced to walk, at knife point, several miles into the foothills above Salt Lake City, where Mitchell's wife, Wanda Barzee, was waiting at a hidden campsite. What followed was 9 months of sustained, horrific captivity, much of which Elizabeth herself would later describe in detail, both in sworn courtroom testimony and in her own subsequent writing and advocacy. Mitchell, who had come to believe he was a religious prophet destined to take multiple child brides, forced Elizabeth into what he considered a form of marriage to him. She was chained to trees at remote campsites using steel cables, sexually assaulted by Mitchell multiple times daily, according to her own later testimony, and forced to consume alcohol and view pornography alongside her captors. She was, at various points, left without adequate food or water for extended periods. Remarkably, and to the horror of investigators and the public alike once it became known, Elizabeth was on several occasions brought into public areas of Salt Lake City during her captivity, her face concealed beneath a veil, seated near searchers and even law enforcement who had no idea the missing girl they were looking for was passing directly among them. At one point, according to Elizabeth's own later account, Mitchell relocated the group to San Diego County, California, before eventually returning to Utah. The scale of the search effort mounted for Elizabeth Smart in the days and weeks following her abduction was, for its era, extraordinary. Thousands of volunteers combed the foothills and canyons around Salt Lake City. Ed and Lois Smart became near constant presences in national media, pleading directly for their daughter's safe return and for any information that might lead investigators to her. For months, the investigation produced frustratingly little. It was not until Mary Catherine's recollection of the abductor's voice matured into a specific, actionable memory connecting it to the roofing worker the family had briefly employed the previous fall that investigators finally had a name and a face to pursue. In February of 2003, police released a composite sketch based on that identification, followed by photographs of Mitchell provided by his own family. The images were broadcast nationally, including on America's Most Wanted, dramatically widening the search for the first time since Elizabeth's disappearance. On March the 12th, 2003, 9 months after Elizabeth was taken, 2 separate couples in Sandy, Utah, a suburb south of Salt Lake City, spotted a man matching the broadcast photographs walking with 2 women. Both couples independently contacted police. Officers stopped the group and questioned them. Elizabeth, disguised in a wig and robes, and initially reluctant to identify herself out of fear instilled in her over 9 months of captivity, eventually confirmed her identity to police. She was found alive, physically within 20 miles of the home she had been taken from 9 months earlier. The recovery made international headlines within hours. Ed and Lois Smart addressed the media with their daughter's safe return, a moment that stood, for a case that had generated so much public anguish, as one of the rare instances in this entire genre of case where the story's central fear that a missing child would never be found did not come true. Brian David Mitchell and Wanda Barzee were both taken into custody on March 12, 2003, and formally charged with kidnapping, burglary, and sexual assault. What followed was an unusually long and legally complicated path toward resolution, driven substantially by questions about both defendants' mental competency to stand trial. Mitchell's defense argued that his conduct had been driven by escalating, genuine mental illness combined with extreme religious delusion that he sincerely believed he was carrying out instructions from God, while prosecutors maintained that he had understood exactly what he was doing and had planned the abduction deliberately in advance. Years of competency hearings and legal delays followed in Utah State Court before the case was ultimately shifted to federal jurisdiction. Wanda Barzee's case proceeded on a different track. After years of her own competency disputes, she pleaded guilty in 2009 to kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor, and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors' testimony that would later prove significant in securing Mitchell's conviction. Brian David Mitchell's federal trial finally began in 2010, nearly 8 years after Elizabeth's abduction. Elizabeth herself, by then 23 years old, took the stand and testified in detail about her 9 months of captivity, describing being awakened with a knife at her throat, believing at first that it was a nightmare, and the sustained abuse that followed. On December 10, 2010, a federal jury found Brian David Mitchell guilty of kidnapping and unlawful transportation of a minor across state lines for the purpose of illegal sexual activity. On May 25, 2011, he was formally sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Elizabeth addressed him directly at his sentencing hearing, a moment widely covered by national media as one of the case's final and most consequential public chapters. Wanda Barzee, having already pleaded guilty years earlier, was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Due to a later dispute over how her sentence was calculated across both federal and state custody, she was released in September of 2018 after serving roughly 9 years, considerably earlier than her family, and the public had generally expected. Wanda Barzee's release drew immediate public alarm, particularly from Elizabeth Smart herself. Smart described the news of the release date as a shock, telling reporters she had been informed only months earlier that Barzee would remain incarcerated until 2024. She stated publicly that she had no viable legal avenue to challenge the release, while emphasizing that she refused to live in a state of fear and asked that officials with the power to reconsider the situation look at it twice. Barzee has continued to live under registered sex offender supervision conditions in the years since her release. In 2025, she was arrested a second time on 2 counts of violating restrictions placed on registered sex offenders after entering public parks in Salt Lake City that she was legally barred from accessing. When questioned by officers, Barzee reportedly told them she had gone there because she believed she had been commanded to by God language. Investigators and Elizabeth's own family noted as strikingly consistent with the religious justifications originally used to explain Elizabeth's abduction more than 2 decades earlier. The Elizabeth Smart Foundation released a public statement following that arrest, expressing concern over the incident and using it to call for stronger enforcement of sex offender registry conditions nationwide, framing Barzee's continued behavior not as an isolated footnote, but as an ongoing illustration of exactly the kind of systemic gap the Foundation's advocacy work is designed to address. Ed Smart, Elizabeth's father, told reporters directly that invoking religious justification could not be allowed to excuse behavior that puts children and communities at risk. In the years since her rescue, Elizabeth Smart has become one of the most visible and consistently active survivor advocates in the country. She founded the Elizabeth Smart Foundation, which focuses on preventing crimes against children and supporting survivors of sexual violence, and she has authored multiple books detailing both her own experience and broader guidance for survivors and their families. She has also become a prominent public speaker on personal safety and self-defense, and has spoken candidly, in the years since her rescue, about the long process of reclaiming her own sense of safety and identity after 9 months defined entirely by someone else's control over her. In January of 2026, Netflix released a documentary titled Kidnapped, Elizabeth Smart, revisiting the case with Elizabeth's direct participation and further public reflection on both her ordeal and the decades of advocacy that followed it. As of 2026, Brian David Mitchell, now in his early 70s, remains incarcerated, serving his life sentence without the possibility of parole. Wanda Barzee, now 80 years old, remains free but under continued registered sex offender supervision, with her most recent violation still working through the Utah court system as of the most recent reporting available. Elizabeth Smart continues her advocacy work through the Elizabeth Smart Foundation and has spoken publicly about carrying her mother's advice with her ever since her rescue, a simple instruction not to let her captors steal one more second of her life than they already had. Elizabeth Smart's case is, in the specific and important sense that matters most, a story with an ending most families on this channel never get. She was found, she was returned home, and the people responsible for what happened to her were identified, tried, and convicted. That does not make her story a simple one. 9 months of captivity, years of complicated legal proceedings, and a kidnapper's accomplice walking free years earlier than expected all remain part of the honest record of this case. What Elizabeth built afterward, a foundation, a public voice, a sustained advocacy career spanning more than 2 decades, stands as one of the more direct examples, among the cases this channel covers, of a survivor shaping the system that failed to protect her into something more accountable for the people who come after. If this episode helped you understand this case in full, please like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to Unsolved and Unforgotten for our next case. She was found. She is not forgotten.